would again.
Yeah, exactly. We'll go back and be like, we need to reread The Origin of Capitalism. Reading this, I was just like, maybe for a nice round number episode, we just reread The Origin of Capitalism.
That book. I mean, yeah.
So much of this, I was just like, well, I guess she said that. It's like, I don't know.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And then we'll reread Needle's book, and then we'll actually read Brenner, as we were just saying. Which this definitely made us realize we've actually never read anything Brenner's written about the origin of capitalism, despite us talking about it so much. So, yeah. What are you gonna do?
That's what you do, isn't it? I think it's fine.
Yeah,
it's just some dudes on the internet, you know.
Yep. Don't listen to us. Just some dudes on the internet. We say, as absolving ourselves of all responsibility to interpret things correctly.
Hey. Nobody gave us any responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Classic
auxiliary statement. Classic auxiliary statements episode for you here today, Dan.
Yes.
In the sense that twofold. One, that we're talking about the origin of capitalism. And two, that we read a chapter from a book and not the book itself. We didn't read like the first chapter of a book. We didn't read the introduction. I said this to my partner. She was like, what are you guys reading this week? And I was like, we're reading a chapter from a book. And she was like, oh, so is it like the first chapter or the introduction? And I was like, chapter 4. So don't know what that
pretending this is a standalone episode that's like pertinent.
Yeah.
So
or as you said, it's a taster for in 50 episodes when we decide to actually read this book.
Yeah. Get ready for the next 10 episodes to be reading various chapters of this book out of order.
Oh, I wish. Oh my God, I wish. There was one point in this that was so funny when he was like, but of course, this is incorrect, as you know from my research in chapter 2. And I was like, yes, the research in chapter 2, of course.
Yes.
What are you going to do? All right. So what we read from a book that seems to be made for us, titled The Birth of Capitalism. And it's just all about, it would seem like, the debates around, Marxist interpretations around the origin of capitalism. By a guy named Henry Heller, we read chapter 4, which was called Bourgeois Revolution.
Bourgeois Revolution.
And I guess that's what it was about. I guess it was about bourgeois revolution. This one was suggested to us by somebody in the Discord, Nom de Noms, because I was like thinking back to the bit in Capital where Marx talks about Holland as being a potential origin of capitalist social relations in the 17th century. And I was like, we haven't really engaged with that in the show before. So I asked some people, I was like, does anybody have anything to read? They were like, yes, this one chapter from this one book. I was like, you read my mind. That's perfect. And yeah, this kind of wound up being that, but then also kind of about something else, as the title of the chapter would say. It's about the concept of bourgeois revolution. And it's basically this author trying to save the idea of the three kind of classic bourgeois revolutions in Holland, in England, and in France. He's trying to reclaim those revolutions as bourgeois and capitalist revolutions, importantly, and capitalist revolutions, kind of as opposed to...
And as an addendum to that, save Marxism. I think.
And save Marxism from the revisionists who are apparently Robert Brenner and Helen Meekson's Wood and all of the people that like them. Don't know anything about this guy. Seems like he's got a bit of a I don't know, grudge, not grudge. Mm-hmm. That seems like a bit much. Mm-hmm. He's got an axe to bear, a cross to bear, an axe to grind. But anyway, I thought it was very good. I thought it was interesting. It would certainly challenge some things ideas that we built the show off of. And what'd you make of it?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was, it is a little, well, it's just a big pulling together of lots of different elements. Obviously, he's engaged in a dialogue that we haven't engaged in the rest of this book, but I felt like it did hang together quite well as a standalone episode. I also was not really aware of the Dutch Revolution, if dare I call it that.
Yeah.
Bourgeois, capitalist, or otherwise. And I mean, I'm now only minorly more enlightened after having read the half of this essay, the 15 pages or so that's dedicated to that. But I have as much of a sense of what happened as is necessary to record an episode of this podcast. But it was interesting to be introduced to those events and have the argument made that they should stand alongside the French and the English revolutions / Civil War as like three definitive examples of a type of historic event that should be recognized thus, I suppose, as an archetypal necessary moment in history. I enjoyed it. And then like I similarly agree, like, well, I think one of the most interesting things about this essay, and what we could talk about later perhaps, is his general criticism of the sort of like quote unquote political Marxists, and his, as you say, like the assertion that what that academic movement, if it is such, what that represents is a form of revisionism of Marxism. And I think we should delve into that because I guess it's, I mean, that a lot of what we like to engage with in the sort of like present and historic sort of landscape of Marxist and other left-wing writings sort of like touch on these topics quite a lot. So there's definitely meat there to be delved into, I suppose.
Just give us somebody engaging with Brenner and Meekson's Wood about the origin of capitalism. We'll make an episode out of it. It'll happen. I think that's the one bit in here that eventually when we get to that, that's maybe the bit that I don't necessarily fully understand him calling the political Marxists revisionists. I certainly understand his gripes with them, I think, but the idea of calling them revisionists, that seemed like it came out of nowhere. And I was like, was this discussed in an earlier chapter? But anyway, we'll get on to that. I think probably we should go through what Henry Heller thinks about these three revolutions, because as we've said on the show before, like there's this idea that I think comes from Ellen Meekson's Wood, although maybe we came across it in the George Comnenal book about the French Revolution.
I mean, I think the first time we touched on it was from reading Meekson's Wood, but in this essay, he says that I think the idea came from Comnenal, who was one of Wood's like PhD candidate students,
and
or something.
Brenner,
so like,
was Meekson's Wood Brenner's like
I'm
student,
not entirely sure, but like I think the seeds of it all
Yeah.
are in Robert Benner, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's this idea.
There's a nexus circling around Robert Benner at the center, you know.
There's academic nepotism going on. It's this idea that Meekson's Wood called the, tell me if I get this backwards, but called the English Revolution capitalist but not bourgeois, whereas the French Revolution was bourgeois but not capitalist. And Henry Heller is basically like, not only is that not true, not only are they both capitalist and bourgeois, both those revolutions, but I'm also going to throw Holland in there and say that their revolution, which definitely occurred and definitely was a revolution, was also bourgeois and capitalist. He brushes over a lot of like Dutch history that I was just like, Jesus, this took a while. It's like the Civil War started in the 1500s. It didn't fucking end until the middle of the 1600s. I was like, oh my God.
Yes, can you have a revolution that takes centuries? You know,
I know, exactly.
You're really stretching the concept. You know? Are you just like so desperate to make like the idea of revolution essential to the transition of capitalism that you've made the transition itself like a revolution, you know?
Yeah. So that's all interesting. You know what I will say is I think that I'm kind of on board with a lot of his interpretations of these revolutions. A lot of it kind of comes down to him being like, Comnenal says that there was no production based off of profit in France before 1789, but I say that there was. And it's like, okay, I don't have no way of knowing which of you is correct. So
I mean,
whatever.
I mean, from our standpoint as not historians, you know, and not having done extensive research about the class dynamics and political economy
or read the research that he did earlier in this book.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it seems, I mean, there is a heavy dose of like pedantic storm in a teacup kind of stuff going on here. I mean, there are some important differences, but I think you could take all of these people and take all of the sort of manufactured disagreement out of it, and what you're left with is a really interesting interchange between people who agree quite a lot on fundamentals and are tackling quite specific questions. And I think the keenness to defend like orthodox Marxism in this essay against the sort of like taint of revisionism sort of for me, I feel like it kind of gets in the way of what is otherwise like what you could identify as being the actual important distinctions, like
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd almost take it a step further and be like, if you got all of these people in a room together, they would just agree. Because it's like, I think he probably wouldn't wind up agreeing with Communal. I don't think Communal would agree with him either. I think that there are like fundamental differences of interpretation of the French Revolution between these two people. But I kind of feel like if you put him and Ellen Meakson's Wood in a room together, they'd kind of be like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. You know what I mean? Like, we'll talk more about what their actual disagreements are, but it's like, oh, she'd probably be like, oh, yeah, no, I wasn't trying to say that, like, all of the necessary conditions for capitalism existed before this one specific point. And like, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it feels like this is like, just kind of the way that like universities and education works, where it's like, oh no, I'm the guy that thinks that capitalism started in this date. And then if like other information comes along, oh, I can't agree with that because my tenure is tied to that, to being that guy. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know.
But I also feel like in some ways it is quite an essential part of like good academia in some ways as well, is to like decide the point that you're trying to make and then like, I guess, fashion an argument, like, I don't know, like fashion the argument around that a little bit, like, or at least let that be the lens through which you see everything.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with that.
I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's just not particularly dynamic, especially like in the social sciences, where if like, because the point of academia should be in like, if we had socialism, it should be that everybody's working together to come to certain conclusions. Whereas I think that a lot of times like your book deals and your professorships are tied to specific opinions that you have that might not change. And credit, because he does say that like Robert Brenner's ideas have evolved throughout his life, but that's probably because he was Robert Brenner and he's allowed to do that. You know what I mean? Like,
and he's like 1 million years old, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Robert Brenner, come on the pod. We know that your friends call you Bob. Come on the pod. All right, I think we actually talk about Holland first, because this was the most interesting thing. The little bits that I remember from like the first volume of Capital where Marx talks about this that aren't quoted in here is basically where Marx is saying that a lot of the early English capitalists were engaging with like manufacturers and wool merchants in the Netherlands, which I mean, like, I suppose like mainly Holland, on the other side of the English Channel. And that this kind of provided a market and like merchant capital that allowed for these new English capitalists to like export all of their goods, and that this actually kind of jump started a lot of the social relations in England as it was becoming capitalist, right? But what Henry Heller focuses on here is this idea of merchant capital, but also, as we've said, trying to make this entire period, which is seemingly like a century of social transformation, political transformation, economic transformation in the Netherlands out to be bourgeois and capitalist. And my understanding of this period is that this was ruled by elements of the Spanish crown. What was the family called? The really inbred family that ruled like all of that with the like fucked up chins and stuff.
Were they Habsburgs at that
Habsburgs,
point?
Yeah. That's what I mean. And that eventually the kind of pressure that was coming from the Protestant merchant capitalists in what would go on to become the Netherlands started to chafe under the like absolutist rule of the aristocrats of the Habsburg dynasty. There was a very long war, which blah, 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 blah. What we care about resulted in the establishment of the Dutch Republic, I believe is what it was called. Yeah, the Dutch Republic in 1648. 1648, very pivotal year in Northern and Western European history. And that once this new political unit came to be, it was completely dominated by merchant capital. And I think that it's kind of difficult for a lot of Marxists to discuss the origin of capitalism in the Netherlands, basically more or less because merchant capital is a type of capital that isn't interested in growth and isn't necessarily interested really at all, only incidentally in improvements in production or even in the production process itself. What it cares about is what we've seen before during this period, which goes back to the origin of trade, basically, which is just exactly that. It's trade. It's buying cheap and selling dear. It's, importing cheap grain from one place, selling it somewhere where where it would be much more expensive. And that because this was the type of capital that was so dominant in the Netherlands, people are kind of hesitant to call this a fully capitalist revolution and a fully capitalist country at this point, which I think is fair. But all Henry Heller is saying here is he's basically saying, don't confuse the fact that there's no productive capital with the fact that there's no capitalism. He's just saying that merchant capital exists in feudalism as it does in, well, he says it exists in feudalism, as does it now. It currently still exists under capitalism. So you can't say that just because you have merchant capitalism, you don't have capitalism at all. And even though it would seem to be something that, could be quite regressive in the historical tautological process of getting from point A to point B, which is feudalism to capitalism, because it's not actually interested in improving the production process, saving labor time, blah, 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 blah. It can be progressive because it dissolves feudal bonds. And that's exactly what it did in what he calls the Dutch Revolution, which was when they broke away from the kind of Spanish-centric crown. I guess so. You know what I mean? It certainly is bourgeois, I suppose. And I suppose you would actually have to do something that he doesn't do in this essay, which is get into what you actually consider capitalism to be. Is capitalism when you have the law of value operating? Is capitalism when you have, the extraction of surplus value? That's not really discussed in here, but I could certainly see where he's coming from and pushing back against this idea that just because there's merchant capital doesn't mean it's capitalism. Mm-hmm. I guess.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's like this is the big open question, and this is the one thing that, I mean, in some ways I agree with his criticism of that's leveled in some ways at Ellen Meeks-Wood and Brenner as and other sort of thinkers who circulate around them, is that the idea that for them it almost feels like you either have capitalism or you don't. People are either proletarians or they're subsistence farmers, and at least for him, he's very fixed. He's focused. He's in the case of all of these revolutions, very keen to identify these relationships as being much more complex, and also, at least in that telling of the story, you then actually have the idea of a process of transformation of social relations and therefore the mode of production. From reading this and remembering back to what Ellen Meeks-Wood says about the Dutch Republic in The Origins of Capitalism, she takes the opposite tack and says that, as a broader part of her argument, she says there are certain things that tend to be associated with the idea of a economy in transition toward capitalism. They are sort of merchant trade or growth in urban populations, growth in the people working in sort of manufacturing in towns. And as a result of that, the growth of the Bourgeois class, I suppose, the growth of the sort of town dwelling population, who in the sort of archetypal conception of the bourgeois revolution are sort of the agents of that revolutionary process. Her argument is that it's possible to have purely feudal types of these things. I suppose it's entirely possible to have a feudal town. It's entirely possible to have manufacture conducted under feudal relations, and pertinent to this argument, it's entirely possible to have broad-reaching trade, which is feudal and not capitalist. I think the essence of her argument is in what you said, where for the Dutch Republic, as Heller is very open to accepting, there is a degree of, as you say, trade that's predicated on buying cheap and selling dear, i.e., trade from one market to another market, and not trade internal to one coherent market system. And for Woods, that's that's almost purely feudalism, pure feudalism. It's a purely feudal type of trade, entirely because it doesn't have that kind of like disciplining market governing the relationships of that trade that's happening. Obviously, Heller is like going down more of a sort of world systems theory argument, which sort of like takes into account parts of the world external to capitalism having a very important role in allowing for the growth of capitalism in its at its core. In this case, in Holland, but in England and France, and sort of that nexus of countries in Western Europe. Yeah, I think coming back to what you're saying about like the argument of like not identifying what it is to be, I can't remember what you said exactly, like to have capitalism. I feel like in this, the argument for all of these people, for Woods, for Brenner, for Heller as well, does seem to circulate quite a lot around market dependence. The peasantry or the sort of like agricultural workers or what have you in a country, whether they have some recourse to subsistence farming, some ownership of means of production that allows them to sustain their existence separate from market relations, separate from having to engage in wage labor. Obviously, I feel like Brenner and Woods take England as sort of the archetypal case because it's like almost it's possible to focus in on just the relations, the sort of agricultural, the relations around agriculture and the class relations and the relationship between landlord and serf in kind of like a or tenant farmer or what have you in like a pure way. The argument Heller seems to be making about at least the northern parts of the Netherlands is that like for various reasons, facts that I think Brenner and Woods and Heller would all agree on, but like seen through a different lens, he's arguing that like there is a significant degree of reliance on market exchange, but also some element of an ability to fall back on subsistence farming to some degree. But like broadly, he's making the argument that there is a proletarian class, there is huge market dependence, and therefore there is capitalism prior to this revolutionary process, I suppose. Don't know whether that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think you've clarified a lot of that. I think what I'm taking mostly from this and what I think is most valuable about this piece is exactly what you're saying about him being a process guy. Like he's very ready to push back against anything that says you either have capitalism or you don't, in a way that historically, at least, I find actually really like refreshing. Because if you do try to take a purely like, as Jason W. Moore said when we interviewed him, formalist approach like Communal does, where it's like it either happened or it didn't, either have proles or you don't, like you're never going to be able to pinpoint when capitalism started if you're that much of a prick about it, because like even now a lot of workers will have access to some minor rent, or oh, what, you're a worker but you retired on a 401k, well, don't you know where 401ks come from? You're not a real prole, right? Like you're not actually going to be able to maybe find that point. But more so than that, I just think that obviously history is a much more long drawn out process. And he says something in here about like when he's talking about the English Revolution, where he says, you know, people didn't wake up one day and go, I was a landed member of the landed gentry yesterday, but today I am a capitalist. It's like, that isn't how history works. That's not how it's ever worked. Like you're going, if you expect to study history and you're expecting to study a transition, you have to kind of be ready to be a bit more loose with dates. Like you can't say as much as we want to find the, one specific farm in what specific year in England, like this all started, you're not going to be able to do that. And I find that really refreshing. I think this is kind of what Jason W. Moore is trying to get across when we were talking to him, which is just like processes are, there's a lot of gray area. Like if we look at the English Civil War, which everybody would agree to a certain extent was perpetrated predominantly in the interests of a growing bourgeoisie to kind of make it easier to implement capitalism, you would look at all of the individual people who were involved in that, just like with the French Revolution, just like with, well, a bit less with the Dutch Revolution, but mainly the English and the French Revolutions. And you would go, oh, okay, like Montagu and Fairfax, I think were like both members of like the titled peerage. They both had like titled peerages. They were like upper echelon nobility. oh, okay, but that wasn't so much true for like Pym and Cromwell, but they were members of the landed gentry. You know what I mean? It's like, but they were also lawyers. Like you wouldn't expect this to be as cut and dry as all of these people were capitalists, all of them were members of the bourgeoisie. I think what Heller's point is he's kind of saying, given hindsight, we can now look back and say all of these revolutions cleared the way for an expansion of capitalism, and they were acting in the interest in expansion of capitalism. And it kind of regardless of what was really going on with the people involved, which is a bit of a like dangerous thing to do because you can't really apply that to like now necessarily. But I think that he is probably right. Like, you know, we can imagine a world where things didn't go exactly the way after these revolutions and we never got capitalism, but that isn't what happened. And so what he's kind of saying is like, it's all a process, man. Which is, I mean, you know, a lot easier than doing what Communal's trying to do, which is be very formal about it, right?
I mean, it's worth important. I mean, there's a degree to which, like, if you get locked into looking at one country case, then you really want to look at the specifics. And at a moment in time, it's worth looking back and being like, this is a process that's happening in multiple parts of a continent, you know, like these England, France, and Holland, they're not like divorced from one another in little bubbles doing their own thing. It is a broader process, so like it's important to point that out. I mean, there's a degree to which I'm not going to push back, but like there's another way of looking at, from what I was saying before about everybody's looking through their own lens and then sort of developing an argument from that. Like in some ways, I think it's worth remembering what it is that or what it is in some ways that what Brenner is setting out to argue when they go down this route, which is that like to remind people of the historic specificity of capitalism separate from the distinct feudal relations of socialism, and to warn people against reading capitalism all the way back through history, this sort of like what he calls the neo-Smithian approach kind of thing. So like I think it's that is a valuable thing to be doing, and one of the things perhaps that results from that, I suppose, is this real fixation on the specificity of what capitalism is, what feudalism is, how you tell the difference between the two. And if you focus too much on that distinction, then you can't see the period of transition to some extent. So like, again, it might just be a question of focus, a question of intent, a question of like, what kind of arguments are they getting embroiled in? What are they focused on, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it is tricky because it's almost like they're coming at it from two different research questions, where it's like, if, you know, Meekson's Wood and Brenner are like, this is what feudalism is, this is what capitalism is. Let's see if we can figure out when things change. And, you know, I don't want to paint them as like they go in there and be like, it was 1648 or whatever. Like they're definitely not doing that. Communal also isn't really doing that. But, you know, it's tricky when that's your research question because you expect to find a moment where it all changed. But the kind of, it's really tricky because like, as opposed to the transition from like the ancient like Roman slave modes to like feudalism, the whole point of capitalism is that it isn't driven by people, is that it isn't driven by like the goals and wishes of one specific like person or even group of people. Like obviously you can say that it's driven by the wishes of the capitalists, but it's not. Like it's driven by in the interests of capital. That's the whole point, is that that's why it's bad, is because production completely rules us. So when you're kind of trying to look at like individual people and individual groups and political parties and all these different things, what you're going to find is a hodgepodge. Whereas even like now, like, you know, political parties don't represent one specific thing other than they all represent continuing the accumulation of capital. It's like they're constantly in flux and constantly changing. You know, it's like I was trying to like do a bit of reading about the Irish Civil War right now, and it's because I'm trying to fucking figure out Irish politics, and it's like, okay, this is what Fine Gael and Fine Gael were set up to do. This is what they do now. This is what they did 50 years ago. And it's just like, it's a similar thing where it's like, if you're trying to really understand the French Revolution, like, you know, certain people are radicals one week and then the next week they're reactionaries, just because of the nature of that's how history changed. So like, yeah, it's almost like it's an impossible task. Like I don't want to be that guy, but like studying transitions is difficult because you're either going to get too bogged down in the minutia and kind of forget that this is all a massive process that really only encompassed the globe relatively recently, or you're going to be like a big process guy. And it's like, well, it started in 1200 and it ended in 2001
ended
with
yet,
China.
you know?
Like, yeah, exactly. So,
Because of what, like, but it's the same as what you were saying before, you know, like if you can have a very, like, a well-defined definition of what the class relations of capitalism are and how they define the social relations between human beings and how those social relations allow for the reproduction of the species on the planet and like facilitate economic activity and exploitation. But then actually when you dig down into like trying to identify these like clearly defined class relations, all you get is, well, like in the best case scenario, like a spectrum of like being quite proletarian to being entirely bourgeois, and then like as you say, you're like, okay, you've got a pension. Okay, well,
yeah,
okay,
exactly.
you own your house and you let out a room. You know, like
scumbag.
I know.
Yeah, it's a trip. This reading got me to think specifically because like we started the show right by reading Miliband, I guess, Marxism and Politics, but also The Origin of Capitalism.
We like to pretend our revisionist history of auxiliary statements starts with Mixon's word.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we should read more Miliband. That'd be interesting to go back to that.
I mean, I'm always keen to go back and what's that one? Is the capitalism and the state, or the state?
Yeah.
State and
we had somebody comment on one of our videos recently, being on that video that we did of the Polancis Miliband debate, being like, if you actually read Polancis, this isn't what he's saying at all. And I was like, wow, that would be the first time anyone has ever like misconstrued someone's argument in a debate. But what are you gonna do?
Oh, so it was that were they pointing at our misunderstanding or Miliband's?
Miliband's.
Oh, okay. Okay.
What
I'm sure we were also wrong, but
yeah, exactly. We were like, we'll read this one letter that Polancis wrote, and then everything Miliband has ever wrote.
Hey, we're in process.
The podcast is a process. But so this reading made me rethink kind of the origin of capitalism, just because like since we've read transition debate stuff, we've also read a lot of value theory stuff. And this specifically made me think about the LL men, because if there's anybody on the planet that you can point to as being like, it's either capitalism or it's not, complete binary, it was that guy, right? Because he was just like, if it's private property and production for exchange, it's capitalism, fuck you. And this got me thinking because like...
and shut up.
Yeah, exactly. Because did I tell you that I met some people that met LL Men and they were like, chill guy? I was like, oh, okay. Cool, nice, that's good to know. Because, okay, so I'll try and kind of get my thoughts together here. Basically, LL Men, when he's talking about the Soviet Union and the so-called actually existing Soviet countries, creates a definition of capitalism, which is basically down to two things: private property, which he says is a social relation, not a legal relation, and production for exchange. He's like, if you have those two things, it's capitalism, right? But that only gets into Marx's theory of value, right? Marx's value theory. It doesn't actually get into his theory of capital, which is the thing that we all actually experience every day. Because I don't know about you, Dan, but like I don't own like a capitalist firm. You know what I mean? Like what we actually experience is another pretty vital thing to capitalism, which is the extraction of surplus value. And Meekson's Wood and Henry Heller and Brenner and Teschke and Comneedle and all of these people put a lot more emphasis. Well, they don't put a whole lot of emphasis on the private property thing. They put a lot more emphasis on extraction of surplus value and like economic dependency, kind of just like full dependency on markets. And it got me kind of thinking like how you would apply both of those things to, I guess, well, not so much a theory of capitalism, but like a theory of the transition, because it's like, I'm interested to know what you think about this, because it's like if you start with a definition of capitalism that is private property and production for exchange, is that where you should logically start from? Because then does that imply a theory of capital? Does that imply surplus value extraction? My thinking is kind of like yes, because if you have a bunch of private producers all operating independently who produce solely for exchange, like they're all going to want to undercut each other. And the only way they can do that, the only way they can create new value is by, producing surplus value or getting their workers to produce surplus value for them. So like if you apply that to the transition debate, it's like when you're looking for the origin of capitalism, should you be looking for when private property relations first started showing up? Or should you be looking like when firms were operating independently of each other? Or should you be looking for hiring wage laborers, because a lot of the like impression and the implication, it seems like, that I get from the transition debate stuff is like, it seemed, especially with Ellen Meakson's Wood, is like it's only capitalism when you get wage laborers, which is kind of like an interesting idea, right? Because it's like, I don't know, but like surely if you wanted to be fully formalist about it, it could just be when there are just all a bunch of like petty farmers in the market. Does that make any sense? Or am I just like, I don't know. It's weird. I'm just kind of thinking about like what are the things you should specifically be looking for, I guess.
Yeah. What is capitalism?
What is capitalism? Or because I guess it's all of those things. But again, like it's a process. I don't know.
Which are the most important, or which ones come first, or like do they suddenly all just exist in one go?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. A lot of value theory people seem like they kind of forego talking about surplus value a lot of the time in historical contexts because it's just about the way that firms interact. But I do appreciate that it's like, well, the thing that we all actually experience is the extraction of surplus value. You know what I mean? And surely alienated labor is like a key thing to understanding when that happened.
I mean, my only response to that is to try and work through some of these arguments for the transition to capitalism with those things in mind, right? So, like, my understanding of the Brenner Woods argument is that, like, and I guess this is important for later sections of this essay, right? And where the actual fundamental disagreement is between one of the places you can find a very fundamental disagreement between Heller and sort of like Brenner adjacent, like the people that are more Brenner than Brenner, it would seem, is that for Brenner and Woods, the kind of initiative almost lies with the English landowning class, the sort of aristocracy class in England, the landlord class kind of thing. At some point, for whatever reason, which maybe we can try and remember back, I don't know, it's sort of articulated in Ellen Meakson's Woods book, but for whatever reason, the landlords of England decide that they want to change the sort of economic relationship they have with their like feudal tenants, and rather than have that relationship be bound by relations of tribute, which are sort of like quite fixed, unchanging over time, they decide instead to change over the relationship to being one that's kind of like a rent system, I think, which is intended to pressure the sort of like pressure the farmers to find ways of producing more cheaply and therefore increasing what they produce. And I suppose the next then step from that is like recognizing that then the farmers are then in competition with one another, and those peasants that become tenant farmers are in a position to take over control of other people's plots if they are able to farm them more productively, and those people that are pushed off of them are forced into a position of like proletarianship, not owning any property and working as wage laborers. What's the argument that comes from that? Therefore, it would seem that it's the extraction of surplus value, the desire to change the social relations in feudal England to transition over to extracting surplus value from the people working the land rather than just taking a fixed surplus, but like actually forcing them to increase their surpluses, that sets in train this process of dispossession, proletarianization, accumulation of private property into the hands of certain capitalists, and the forcing into a wage labor, a position of being a wage laborer for other people. I don't know then.
Well, it's interesting because that then seems like it's almost a different impetus to surplus value extraction than one that we're used to, which is firms in competition with each other, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like the genesis of capitalism wasn't the fact that firms were in competition with each other. It was that they were like trying to get one over on or is it that their landlords were trying to get one over on them? You know what I mean? It's
Yeah, the
interesting.
question is then, at what point do market relations come into effect?
Between firms, because obviously it's like it's already between, like, for subsistence for workers, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what is a firm in this context? It's the expanding successful capitalist farm versus the failing, like, farmer who can't meet the demands of ever increasing rent that's being put upon them by the landlords, and are therefore bought out, taken over, replaced, I suppose, by capitalist farmers who are in a position to meet those demands. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out that, like, incredibly essential for Woods and Brenner's argument, as I understand it, is the relatively small, condensed, united market relations that exist or are able to exist in England at the point of this transition. It's possible for all of these farmers to compare all of these landlords, I suppose, to compare all of these, and also all of the farmers to compare the relative, like, worth value, should we say, of the things that they're producing vis-a-vis all the other people in that economic area on a big enough scale that competitive forces come into play, I guess.
Yeah, but then again,
I think that's the argumentation as I understand it. But
I think you're absolutely right. That's clarified loads for me. But then it's interesting because then you're kind of back to it just being one long massive process, because it's like maybe it isn't truly until they make, I know in Meekson's Wood there's loads of stuff about people being like, oh, actually it's way more profitable and way easier to just have a fuck ton of cattle on our property instead of trying to grow wheat like we need for food. And a similar thing happened in the Netherlands, right? Where, like, this is then when all of those producing firms, for lack of a better word, like, got tied into, like, markets. But then it seems like it would take kind of like a while for those things to even out and the norm be production solely for market determined value. Although I don't know, like, to what extent is those, or like, surely those landlords couldn't just set whatever fucking price they wanted on their rents, right? Like, that would have been a certain type of market dynamic. Maybe we didn't get capitalism until the invention of the steam engine. I mean,
maybe it is just technology, Jack.
It's just technology. But I mean, maybe, I don't know, because you do hear people talk about, like, the first actually truly properly fully subsumed capitalist industry wasn't necessarily British agriculture, it was British textiles. So maybe it's just a matter of subsumption, right? Like, it would be crazy to imagine that, again, nobody is saying that capitalism just popped into existence fully formed without any marks of feudalism on it, right? Like, yeah, I'm formalist brained because I'm trying to get to, like, specific with it. Like, obviously there are going to be times where it's capitalism with a little bit of feudalism, and there's still feudal. Aren't there some parts of England still where it's like you don't buy a house when you buy a house, you buy, like, the deed to the house or something like that? Isn't that still a thing?
Yeah, or you don't own the land on which the house sits, so you have to pay a ground rent, or you've got a technical lease for 1,000 years from the landowner. That's so probably cool. A royal or something.
That's so cool.
Yeah, who knows?
Well, interesting stuff. It's all very interesting stuff. Where'd you like to go?
I suppose maybe something to then point out, as I was hinting at before, is this, like, one of the fundamental distinctions between these two schools of thought is to say that, like, according to Heller, Brenner is deviating quite a lot from Marx's conception of this process, because according to Heller, for Marx, the transition to capitalism does happen in agriculture in England, but they put at the sort of, like, Marx and Heller ostensibly put at the head of this process the agency of the farmers, whereas Brenner puts at the process the agency of the landlords. It's it's the sort of the process of historical change is actually controlled for Brenner read through the lens of Heller. Like Heller is accusing Brenner of saying, or the troubling implication of what Brenner is saying is that like it's not actually the new emergent class which is the one that creates the revolutionary change between modes of production, but it's actually the ruling class of feudalism that institute the change in social relations that result in the transition to a new mode of production. And that has troubling implications, right? Like the reason why Brenner and Woods are revisionist is because the troubling implication of their argument is to say actually the fundamental agent of the transition to communism won't be the working class. And the implication that is also in things that we say sometimes, right? When we've read Brenner or when we were reading about the transition to China in capitalism, and we were saying, well, no, the process of transition comes about by the ruling class trying to maintain present conditions. The implication of that is, again, it's like the agent is not who we would want it to be. You know, the agent is not a revolutionary. It's not the new up and coming class. The transition from one mode of production to another is like an accident of happenstance. It's a failure to, or a success, depending on how you look at it. But like, it's an attempt to keep things the same that accidentally results in a sort of fundamental historical break, I suppose.
I kind of think that's a fair criticism. Like the kind of error, though, I think in logic there is that like, even if that is what Brenner's saying, and even if that is what happened in terms of a ruling class being the one to actually dictate the transition, there's no reason to then connect that to the transition to socialism. Like, just because that's how it happened in the transition to capitalism doesn't then mean that that is how it is going to happen in, like, you know, our glorious, like, Hilferding general cartel transition to socialism. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
But, you know, I do think that there's something, because I do remember coming away from the Ellen Meekson's Wood stuff, not quite like black pilled, maybe like gray pilled, thinking a little bit like, oh, so it was just like, you know, the ruling class kind of just trying to keep the status quo. That doesn't necessarily make me feel too good about the transition to socialism. But again, like, yeah, I don't know if that necessarily is then counterposed to a revolutionary bourgeoisie as a historical agent. Also, like, you know, again, it's going to be loads of different things. We're talking about like a massive civilization defining change. Like, it's going to be a bunch of different things.
I mean, I feel like the other way to look at it is like it's the crisis of a system.
Yeah.
There's a system in crisis. How do the people that live under that system sort of like adapt the system so it can continue existing? Like, the process of revolutionary transition isn't jumping from capitalism to communism, you know? Like, there is a process of transition, as we've been hinting at throughout this, but as it's worth emphasizing, like, there's two ways to look at this, right? Like, there is you can I guess you can imagine in your ideal system there's like a pure bourgeois class and a rising tide of proletarian consciousness which like recognizes that it's been exploited and sort of like sweeps away whatever and blah 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 blah. But really, like, it's just individuals in muddy and mixed class relations, class positions, with differing degrees of consciousness, probably almost always confused, you know, like
chaotically.
Yeah. Like it's not a formal system. It's a very chaotic process.
Yeah. And I mean, also when you're talking about just like broad abstract ideas of like capitalism and feudalism and the transition between the two, you're kind of like, there's a little bit of term slippage for when you then go and do a like Charles Beard thing with the American Revolution and go, well, here's what these individual specific people did, and this is why it turned out to be like that. Because it's like, you're talking about the concrete, you're talking about the broader abstract notions of things. Like, those aren't always going to line up one to one. And this also just speaks to, like, you know, what a law is conceptualized to be in Marxism. It's not something that you can't break. It's something that asserts itself in aggregate over the long haul. It's a tendency, right?
Yeah.
Like tangential fold in the rate of profit.
In interaction with auxiliary statements.
Wow. Plug for the Patreon. But it's like the tangential fold in the rate of profit exists, a million different things to counteract it, right? So it's still a law, but the introduction of credit doesn't then mean that it doesn't exist. So it's like, okay, Montagu was like a, fucking earl of whatever. That doesn't mean that he isn't then also acting in the interests of capitalism, right? Yeah.
And then, with that argument, there's another way we can re-look back at the idea of bourgeois revolutions, and say like it is historically quite likely that, at least in the case of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, there is going to be the necessity of some application of some amount of, I don't know, like force, revolutionary violence, like forced change in how the state operates to remove certain fetters from the sort of free operation of capitalism that are placed upon it by, elements of the economy and the ruling class, which like are still trying to follow different laws that get in the way. You don't then have to go like all the way down the rabbit hole with Heller and say that like these three revolutions were all like achieved exactly the same thing. They were all capitalist before their revolutions in exactly the same way. The revolution was absolutely necessary. It always has to happen, and the result had to always be the same in all three cases. Like you can't, like, one of the things that I don't really think he engages very well, he does engage it in a lot of ways, but like I feel like there is something justified in what Communal Communal is trying to do, but like Brenner and Woods agree in some respects. There is something justified in what they're trying to do in this distinction between a bourgeois revolution and a capitalist revolution. Like in England, the revolution, maybe it was more predominant in its effort. The predominant effort was to like advance the interest of the capitalist class. That was not done primarily by town dwelling, petty producers, new capitalists, I can't remember what they're called in the language, like the middle class or
the middlemen,
the middle something, I don't know. And maybe you can make the argument that in France it was entirely done by entirely that class, but their intention was not necessarily to bring about capitalism or bring about the same changes in relations. Like that might be too extreme of a reaction to say that like one is capitalist and not bourgeois and one is bourgeois and not capitalist. But there is, to me anyway, something valuable in digging into the specificity of those revolutions and creating that potentially artificial distinction to draw attention to something important, which is they happened in different ways, and maybe one was more advanced in its capitalism and one wasn't, and like they had different, there were different class elements intending to do different things, and they weren't necessarily all singing to the same hymn sheet. Heaven forbid, like our communist revolution might not be like a pure affirmation of like class consciousness from every proletarian as they sort of like sweep away the bourgeoisie. Like I don't know.
We might not all be
feel like I'm ranting
like me. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that you're absolutely, it's absolutely, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I mean, but again, like if you want to make a name for yourself and actually studying these things, you do have to seemingly come down on having specific opinions about specific revolutions, even though everyone likes to pretend that these things weren't entirely contingent on the smallest things and could have gone radically different directions. We're all studying history with hindsight and kind of just being like, tell you what, if you want to make a name for yourself as a Marxist and you don't want it to be controversial at all, just talk about the American Revolution, because every single person involved in that was just like, yeah, we're capitalists, we don't want proles in power. It's not like you didn't have like counts getting involved.
And we're trying to escape the absolutism of England.
Mad King George. One thing I will say to kind of maybe do a little bit of defending of Heller, because I do actually, I find myself really drawn to his like idea of all of this as a process. And even though it smacks a little bit of like hindsight bias, that's all we kind of have. I'll just read this because I do think that regardless, this is very good. He says, classes are constantly being shaped and reshaped, a process out of which history is made. A whole class does not become radicalized or class conscious at once. And the middle sort, there you go, lacked the coherence to assume a common class position. Groups became conscious as a result of themselves as classes in opposition to other classes. And then blah, 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 blah. He says, as we have seen in the name of political Marxism, for some reason, I was reading this, I read it as like Trump and like woke political Marxism. But in the name of political Marxism, Teschke asserted that the English Revolution was not bourgeois, but was capitalist. I beg to differ. In accord with Manning, I accept the view that the revolution was made by a bourgeoisie in formation rather than a fully fledged bourgeoisie in the style of the Victorian age. Indeed, I accept the view that a bourgeois revolution does not require the bourgeoisie as a necessary agent, provided that it clears the way for further advance of capitalism. That's a pretty, whoa, that's a fascinating point. On the other hand, the role of the new merchants of London in making the revolution, the social makeup of the Republican governments, and the outcome of the revolution justify us in continuing to refer to the English Revolution, much like the Dutch Revolution, as capitalist and bourgeois, blah, 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 blah. And he also goes on to say that it doesn't entail the complete destruction of the aristocracy, obviously, because we still have an aristocracy in England. And I just think that's a very, very good point. I think that, like, if nothing else, we should take from this that the idea of classes existing all at once is silly, and that you do have to understand that when we're talking about this early bourgeoisie, whether it's in England or, you know, Holland or in France, we're talking about people who won't have the attributes that we expect them to have. And I think that him bringing up the, like, you know, picturesque ideal of like a top hat monocle wearing like Victorian era capitalist isn't necessarily one that you should have when you're imagining these people, because these are going to be people stamped with the like society that came before them, which is why Oliver Cromwell's dad was a member of the landed gentry, which is why you got like members of the landed gentry fighting on both sides. But again, like, it seems like what Heller is just trying to say is the function of a system is what it does. And we got capitalism, and capitalism seemed to be on its way. And all of this did help bring capitalism about. So with hindsight, we can now say bourgeois and capitalist, which is a very funny argument, but I kind of buy it, honestly.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I do like when he's like, we don't even need the bourgeoisie as a necessary agent in the bourgeois revolution. That was like, oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, there is something very specific. There's I guess, from what I was just saying, there's a very specific emphasis on the class agent in Comnenal and Woods, and that quote's really poignant. I guess what I will also say is that, like, he does provide quite a lot of quite compelling class analysis of these three countries, France, Holland, and England, that sort of like goes quite a long way to combating some of the sort of like absolutism of Comnenal and Woods in saying that this is bourgeois and not capitalist. And he sort of like digs quite a lot into the class relations to sort of point out contradictory formations and examples of this, as in the language that we've been using, as like a sort of process and not like a fixed set of conditions.
Bourgeoisie information, yes. Proletariat information. It's interesting. It's good stuff. And
they say.
So they say. Yeah, exactly. I'm a communist in transition, I'll say. By which I mean I'm unemployed. The one thing that we haven't touched on with him, and this kind of, that it does help kind of like backstop this whole theory of his about like capitalism as process and transition as process, I guess, is that like he has a really, I would say, sound understanding of what the state is in capitalism and what its primary function is, where he kind of says that, you know, whether or not this is actually true, I don't particularly care. He says that like the political Marxists, you know, they don't really put too much importance on these revolutions, because for them, you already had the necessary conditions for capitalism occurring prior to these revolutions. And he says, be that as it may, it wasn't sufficient for capitalism to actually show up, because what it is that the state actually does is it produces the necessary kind of circumstances for the reproduction of a given set of social relations that set of social relations can't do on its own, right? So like capitalist extra economic coercion can't on its own. It can make me get up and go to work, but it can't keep me on welfare, or it can't, pay for after school things, or can't pay for healthcare. I know I'm just listing things that the capitalist state like no longer really does in most places, but like this is what it's supposed to do, right? It's supposed to like look after people in a way that the uncaring like hand of capitalism can, and that counts just as much for capitalists as it does for proles, right? Where given, left to its own devices, capitalism would just rip itself apart in the next crisis, right? This is why we have quantitative easing. This is why we have a whole load of other things that the capitalist state does that the given set of social relations can't do. And so for him, he's basically applying that logic, which I think is really true, to revolutions by saying, look, here's all of the things that these revolutions did that fundamentally altered the given, nation that they existed within, state that they existed within's government. And without those changes, you wouldn't have gotten capitalism. Those needed to happen at one point or another. Thus, these are capitalist relations. And, he goes through and he says how like the Star Chamber and all of these different kind of like stupid, fucked up, like feudal things were thrown out during the English Revolution, and they weren't bought back. Yes, they bought back a king, but it also, truly substantiated the bourgeois parliament as, like a player in English politics that would never go away, right? In France, it established certain right-of-ways for members of the bourgeoisie, private property rights, even ideological things like, rationalism, quote unquote, like, and in Holland, it got rid of the like dead weight of the absolutist monarchs that had been ruling the Netherlands up until then, and allowed for the expansion of merchant capital, and then, productive capital following along after that. And I think that's really sound logic. Like if that's what he's basing his idea on, these were capitalist and bourgeois revolutions on, I think it's probably true. Again, it gets a bit tricky though, because he is using hindsight to be like, it turned out to be this way. These turned out to be necessary for capitalism. And so these were capitalist and bourgeois, whereas you don't have to take that like leap of faith if you're Brenner or Meekson's Wood or whatever, because you say these are the conditions that were capitalism. It was capitalism, right? But if nothing else, it's a good theory of the state, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I entirely agree with that. I mean, the only thing that I really find troubling about it is the kind of like the fixation on this is what like orthodox Marxism is. This is how we've historically always defined. Like what a bourgeois revolution is. This is how we've always understood class relations and classes in politics, or the political role of the proletarian class. And by deviating from that automatically makes Woods and Brenner and Comnenal and whoever not like interesting free thinkers who are willing to like dig down and try and find the truth of this, but rather like deviant revisionists who are just like reacting to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the new postmodern conditions, and follow be sort of tailing bourgeois historians in their ideological critique of what has been up until that point, like the fundamental Marxist understanding. I don't know. Part of me sort of wants to say, well, you could read the argument the other way around and be like, just because it looked like the proletariat were a rising class at the beginning of the 20th century, like those conditions led people to look at history and through a particular lens. I mean, that's not necessarily what I think, but like,
yeah. The paragraphs in here where he is like trying to conflate political Marxism with neoliberalism, I was like, what's the point here? It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah. But there is a troubling, like there is something that I'm going to take away from this in a sort of like for broader and further consideration in the future, is that like well, I mean, we're already well down this road vis-a-vis some of the things we've read, right? The reason why like certain like left communist texts that we've read or whatever seem appealing is because they seem to speak to our present condition, which see a world without the seeming material basis for what used to be the traditional conception of a revolutionary strategy of Marxists. But I don't know. Like I mean, this is the present and evident not necessarily contradiction, but like problem that needs to be grappled with, I suppose. And like maybe we are attempting to do that in our own little way, but like
with
I don't know,
auxiliary
maybe
statements.
maybe a certain like dogmatic fixation on like the fundamental role of the proletariat and the necessity to bring about their conscious realization of themselves as the class to transform society and save us all from capitalism. Like, maybe there's something virtuous in that. Like, well done, Henry Heller. Like I don't
Yeah,
know.
he saved us from the evil vices of political Marxism. What are you gonna do?
Yeah,
I
maybe being puritanical is good. I'm really not sure.
yeah, being Puritans is good. Maybe that's what he's saying. This is why we're all fifth monarchists here at Auxiliary Statements.
Great hats.
There are a few more things I kind of want to get to that are just kind of like random bits. I really appreciated his discussion about like ecological crises as playing a role in the Netherlands to a transition to capitalism. And when we read, I believe it was Perry Anderson in the Transition Antiquity to Feudalism book, I think. I brought this up on the show before just because I really like this bit in that book where he talks about how, we always imagine feudalism as like zero growth or low growth. I suppose it was low growth, but he makes the point in there that feudalism absolutely saw growth. It was just kind of like an absolute style of growth where, because the ruling class of the aristocracy wanted more and more from the peasantry, and because the peasantry kind of wanted more and more for itself, you saw kind of like land reclamation projects in England that kind of culminated in the High Middle Ages around the 1200s. And you can see this in the ecological record, when the last primeval forests were cut down and when wolves went extinct in the British Isles and all this different stuff, right? But that kind of like led to a real butting of the heads between those two classes, between the producing class and the ruling class in the High Middle Ages. Heller here is making a similar point where he says that in Holland, there were loads of these land reclamation projects that went on in the Netherlands specifically that kind of came to a culmination around I suppose, like 16th and 17th centuries, where loads of this reclaimed soil, where they drained, marshland to make, room to grow grain and stuff like that. Eventually, the peat in the ground all settled, and that led to kind of really soggy ground, whereas before it kind of wasn't. And so this led to all of the producers on this kind of reclaimed land going, okay, well, we can't grow grain on here anymore because it's too wet, but we can still have cattle and stuff like that. And that kind of pushed them into market dependency for subsistence, as well as, needing to sell their cattle. And this led to kind of like a importation of grain, cheap grain from Eastern Europe, which has its own implications, blah, 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 blah. But the reason I kind of wanted to touch on that is because I find it really interesting the way in which this played out in both countries, that two different classes can be attempting to maintain the status quo, and in attempting to maintain the status quo, utterly destroy their ecological surroundings in a way that they recognize, and how that can lead to a, heavy air quotes here, the listener can't see this, progressive role in history, right? Where it leads to a kind of impetus for the change of social relations. Heller brings this up to basically just, it's another thing in his process argument to basically just say it wasn't just this one thing, it wasn't just that, it was loads of different things. Like you don't get revolutions in the natural course of things, you get revolutions when there's like really bad harvests all of a sudden, right? Given these already like bad circumstances. And I just thought it was interesting, like maybe I'll say again, there's some use for that in our current times where it's becoming, blatantly obvious that a given set of social relations can't maintain itself ecologically. But I did find it interesting that he was able to tie in the ecology that was slowly being ruined by these two classes and in ways in which that was adapted to eventually what I guess like Postone would call like abstract space under capitalism. But yeah, again, it's just another thing too to just say that there was growth under feudalism, and that it wasn't good.
Yeah, I mean that was a really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it in that way. As like, here is another impetus to a change in social relations. I mean, he's making the point that that form of ecological destruction, the changing of the types of crops that it's possible to grow, were like pushed people into a proletarian condition, or not in a proletarian condition necessarily, but like in a position of market dependence. But yeah, it's an interesting point that like ecological rather destruction can result in the necessity to change social relations, I suppose. So.
And again, just like it was an attempt to maintain the status quo, which again we found can be the impetus for change a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And then only other really quick points, just two things that I found interesting on that kind of importation of cheap grain from Eastern Europe in the Netherlands thing. Ellen Meekson's Wood sees that and basically sees that as proof that Holland and the Netherlands specifically weren't fully capitalist, because they were requiring all of these, what Jason W. Moore would call like free gifts from the outside. All Heller says to that is capitalism has always required extra economic, not necessarily coercion, but gifts. And that was the case then, and he says that's the case now. I thought that was a really interesting point. And then kind of coming off of a very similar thing, when he's criticizing Communal, he basically just calls him a purist, and he just says that Communal, and this is something we've already touched on, but he says it's the idea that you're only a proletariat if you buy everything from the market. And he kind of uses this when he's discussing the French Revolution to say, look how many people still had plots of subsistence farming in France through 1789. I forget exactly what preposterous date he says far in the future it was until they had fully capitalist social relations. But again, this is why Communal gets criticized as a formalist, because he's trying to say you either have capitalism or you don't, whereas people like Heller are like, no, it's much more of a process. And even though you have these subsistence farmers, they're still selling their labor elsewhere. Heller would call that capitalism. Communal wouldn't. I don't necessarily care, because I think it's important to kind of have both voices there, but whatever. Yeah. You're obviously, like I said at the beginning, you're obviously not going to be fully formalist, because then you would be like, we still don't have capitalism. But yeah.
Maybe we don't.
Maybe we don't.
I mean, it's an important point you make about like kind of like the free gifts of nature, the externalities. That's one of the big. I guess maybe it's one of the features of the kind of like purism of the Brenner argument, that it is an argument that can be made potentially for an origin of capitalism that doesn't require some kind of external input. Whereas obviously like the sort of like Wallastinian world systems theory idea of the transition to capitalism, such that we've engaged it in a limited way and understand it through other people, it is predicated on the idea that it's only with the inputs from colonial sort of exploitation of a world external to the world of European capitalist class relations, or capitalist social relations, that you can sort of like, it's the most fundamental process, the part of the process of primitive accumulation that supplies the necessary capital for then the reinvestment process, the sort of MCM process to start. Yes, maybe an aside, but in this, he seems to go all the way down the sort of Wallastinian route and say that the first capitalist country was actually Spain, and Holland was the second. That's his, like, if we're ranking, if we're in the process of
leaderboard,
if we're going to do the tier list of like capitalist countries, purely on that basis that like Spain was the preeminent colonial power, and it's some South American holdings. You can go all the way back to whatever episode it was when we read about that.
That's wild.
Yeah, but I don't
I'll
know.
say that's wild.
Yeah.
I'll take it. What are you going to do? How far back can we go? We need to find the Marxist that goes the furthest back. Yeah. We've never read any Banaji.
Rome.
Yeah, Rome, exactly. The first capitalists.
I mean, it's not. Nobody says that.
The Phoenicians. It's interesting though. Like that, what you're saying kind of made me think that like, it seems like we broadly, just meaning like Marxists in general, seem to have two different sets of two slightly different mindsets and criteria for transitions when we talk about so-called socialist revolutions that we do for like the transition debate to capitalism. Because, imagine applying the like stereotype of Communal that Heller presents here to China's development of capitalism. It would be crazy. It would be crazy to try and be like, Well, China still has state-owned enterprises, so like, is it fully like, I don't know. There are some people that aren't fully, reliant on the market. It's like that would be a crazy way to think about things. So it's just funny because it's like I've just got me thinking that the way that we discussed China when we talked about it in one of our more recent episodes was very different to the way in which it seems like we're talking about the transition to socialism or capitalism in England. And I think that's maybe just because we're more ready in a fucked up, weird psychological way. We're more ready to be critical of like the Chinese Communist Party or the, USSR than we are of like 17th century British capitalists, which is kind of funny. But it is interesting. I mean, I guess that's because those were supposed to be positive projects, creating something different. They wound up just recreating the one thing they weren't supposed to recreate. But yeah, there's no room for formalism, it would seem, in discussing China or really the Soviet Union. I suppose people do it more so when they talk about the Soviet Union, but now most people are just like, it ain't communism, man. Although there are still some people, I said, somebody did comment on our video and was like, I think it's communism. And I was like, fair enough.
I mean, the complicating factor in that is that they were ostensibly trying to do something else,
Yeah,
they transitioned to capitalism whilst ostensibly, at least to some degree, trying to implement the next mode of production. I mean, I guess there is an interesting, like, I don't know, have anything to say about it. Maybe we can try and find in future somebody, some writing or some piece that grapples with this. But there is, I guess, there must be in history a point where the idea of a bourgeois revolution, the idea of a transition to capitalism or an unfettering of the transition to capitalism through an avowedly political process becomes a conscious thing, right? Like it's interesting the way it has an interplay with the development of like orthodox Marxist ideas, right? Like, the conception that you have to have a bourgeois revolution before you can have a communist one almost becomes something that communists strive for in certain cases. But like, you could probably look at processes that happen in France in the middle of the 19th century, or the advent of the German or the Italian states in the 1870s. Like, you could look at them in a different way to these the first bourgeois revolutions. Maybe there is a more conscious political process that's at play there. Maybe there are, I don't know, then maybe they deserve a different type of analysis and should be considered should be given more weight when we're considering what a conscious political process of transition looks like. I don't
know. Yeah, or even if we've seen a conscious political transition ever.
We have, yeah.
Because like even America, it was like, we just want to make more money, and this is the best way to do that.
Yeah. and they're still also suitably messy in the way that we've been talking about. Like there is no pure like pure political process, I guess.
Except for the coming communist one.
Yes,
that one will be
Tell
easy,
your friends.
Pure, and we'll all be friends. It'll all be fine. Well, all right. That was interesting. Food for thought, definitely. Henry Heller come on the pod. Not sure when he wrote this. I was going to get the book, but I was looking on like used sites and it was like absurdly expensive. But then I saw you can just get it from Zero Books for like $14. And I was like, I should have just done that. Whatever. One of these days.
Oh, this book.
Yeah, this book.
Yeah.
Bourgeois
a lot of great
Revolution.
footnotes to chase up in this,
Yeah, I know. I printed it out. I printed out this chapter and all the footnotes. I was like, that'd be interesting. And then I flipped to the back. I was like,
I was doing endless, like scroll all the way to the back of the book and then scroll all the way. Just put your footnotes on the page.
That's what I'm saying. What I'm saying. All right. Well, this was very interesting. Thanks again to the person who suggested this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll be back again with something soon. Thank you very much, Dan. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. It's been great. A good one.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.